Which is more unforgivable, a monster that wants to destroy you, or one that makes you destroy yourself? Sit with that for a second, because that question is the entire difference between Vecna and Pennywise. And by the end of this video, I'm going to argue that both of them represent something that no writer, no narrative, no redemption arc can ever clean up. Not because they're too powerful, because of what they chose to do with their power. And the specifics of those choices will make you look at both franchises completely differently. But first, let's establish something that most people get wrong about villains at this level. We spend a lot of time debating whether villains like Negan or Vader deserved redemption. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll leave it right here, because what we're about to get into builds directly on that argument, and you're going to want that foundation before we go further. But Vecna and Pennywise exist in a different category entirely, and almost nobody talks about why. These aren't men who made brutal choices inside a brutal world. These are beings who looked at human suffering and decided it was a resource, something to be harvested, cultivated, enjoyed. That distinction matters enormously, and I'm going to prove it to you one layer at a time. Here's the first thing that should disturb you about Henry Creel. Before Vecna had a name, before the Upside Down, before the Mind Flayer, there was a boy in a house in Hawkins, Indiana, who watched his mother and sister and decided, with complete calm, that they needed to die. Not in a moment of rage, not as a reaction to abuse or trauma. Henry Creel studied his family the way a scientist studies specimens, identified them as inferior, and removed them. He was 12 years old, and the detail that the show almost buries, the one that should reframe everything you think about his later arc, is that he enjoyed the silence afterward. That's not a villain origin story. That's a diagnosis. Now hold that image. Hold the specific texture of that enjoyment, because I want to compare it to the first time we truly understood what Pennywise was. And I don't mean the clown. I mean the thing behind the clown. Most people process Pennywise as a fear predator. He identifies what you're afraid of, wears that shape, and feeds on the terror response. Simple, elegant, horrifying. But the detail that King buried in the mythology, the detail the films gesture at but never fully commit to, is that Pennywise doesn't need the fear to survive. The fear makes the meat taste better. It's seasoning. It's refinement. Pennywise is an ancient, cosmic entity that evolved the capacity for cruelty not out of necessity but out of preference. And that one distinction should stop you cold, because we can construct a moral framework around hunger. We can almost understand a predator that kills to eat. What we cannot construct a framework around, what no redemption arc can ever address, is a being that developed sophistication and cruelty as a form of aesthetic appreciation. Pennywise doesn't just want you dead, it wants you afraid first. It wants the specific vintage of your particular terror. It spent 30 years cycling through Derry, feeding, retreating, feeding again, and in all that time never once demonstrated anything resembling restraint or conflict or the faintest shadow of remorse. That's not a monster waiting to be understood. That's a monster that has already understood itself completely and chosen this. Now here's where it gets complicated. And this is the part of the video where I need you to stay with me, because I'm about to make an argument that goes against the grain of how most people defend Henry Creel. A significant portion of the Stranger Things audience argues that Vecna is sympathetic because of Brenner, because of the lab, because a child with extraordinary abilities was taken, experimented on, isolated, and weaponized by a system that was supposed to protect him. And that argument isn't wrong exactly. The abuse happened. The institutional cruelty was real. Brenner is not innocent, but here's what that argument consistently skips over. Henry Creel murdered his family before Brenner ever touched him. The ideology was already formed. The capacity for that specific, calculated, pleasurable cruelty was already fully developed in a 12-year-old boy in a house in Indiana. Brenner didn't create a monster. He found one, tried to weaponize it, failed to contain it, and paid the price. The lab trauma gave Vecna a mythology. It gave him a coherent villain's narrative, but it didn't manufacture the core. The core was always there, and Henry Creel chose it at an age when choice still meant something. That's the line. That's the exact line that makes forgiveness structurally impossible. And Vecna knows it. This is what separates him from almost every other villain in the franchise landscape right now. He is lucid about what he is. There's no self-deception, no cognitive dissonance. When he explains himself to Eleven, he isn't rationalizing. He isn't performing regret to manipulate her. He is calmly, precisely, accurately describing a worldview he developed independently, tested empirically, and committed to completely. He believes in what he's doing. He has always believed in it. And the horror of that clarity is that it removes every narrative handhold we normally use to approach a villain with complexity. You can't reach someone who doesn't think they're lost. Pennywise operates differently, but arrives at the same destination. Where Vecna is lucid, Pennywise is ancient. Where Vecna operates on philosophy, Pennywise operates on appetite refined into art. And the specific horror of the deadlights. The thing that King understood in the film's gesture toward is that they don't just kill you, they show you the true indifferent scale of the universe and break your mind against it. That's not predation, that's contempt. Pennywise doesn't fear humanity enough to hate us. It finds us quaint, small, briefly entertaining. Contempt at that scale has no redemption arc. There's no version of that story where Pennywise looks at a child in a sewer and experiences something that changes the calculus. The calculus has been running for millions of years. It concluded long before Derry was built. So here's where I want to draw the line between these two specifically, because they're not identical and the difference matters. Vecna is unforgivable because of agency. He had a human origin, human cognition, and made fully conscious human choices to become what he is. Every step was deliberate. Every victim was selected. Every psychological wound he opened in those kids, Max, Chrissy, Fred, was opened with surgical intention. He isn't a force of nature. He is a man who decided, repeatedly, over decades, to be this. That decision-making capacity is exactly what makes forgiveness philosophically impossible. Because forgiveness requires a cost, and Vecna has never once registered anything as a cost. Pennywise is unforgivable because of duration, not because it made a choice once, but because it made the same choice, in the same town, to the same vulnerable population, for 30-year cycles across what appears to be geological time. Derry's history of violence, the massacres, the fires, the disappearances, isn't collateral damage. It's cultivation. Pennywise shaped a community into a fear production machine and tended it across centuries. That's not appetite, that's agriculture. And you do not rehabilitate a farmer who has been growing children's fear for millennia. You burn the field. Which brings me to the question that I suspect is already forming in the back of your mind. And it's the right question. If both Vecna and Pennywise are structurally unforgivable, if the moral architecture of their respective stories requires that they be destroyed rather than redeemed, then why does modern television keep hedging on this? Why does Stranger Things spend so much of its final season gesturing at Henry Creel's trauma as though it's mitigation? Why does the IT mythology keep leaving threads that suggest something more complicated than simple evil? Why are writers so uncomfortable with the idea of a villain whose answer is just no, not redeemable, not a product of circumstance, not someone we can understand our way to forgiving? Just no, because the answer to that question is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. And I want you to think about this before I give it to you. Every time a writer refuses to let a villain be completely, irredeemably, finally evil, who are they actually protecting? Not the villain. The most unforgivable thing about Vecna and Pennywise isn't what they did. It's that they knew exactly what they were doing every single time, and they did it anyway. That clarity, that absence of self-deception, is what makes them immortal as villains. And it's what makes any attempt to soften them a betrayal of exactly what makes them matter. A monster with a motive you can trace is a monster you can negotiate with in your head. A monster that chose itself completely and finally is a monster that forces you to accept something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Some things cannot be explained into innocence. Some choices cannot be walked back. Some ledgers cannot be balanced. Vecna knows this. Pennywise has known it longer than human language has existed. The only question left is whether the writers know it too. Drop your undead opinion below. Is Vecna more unforgivable than Pennywise because he was once human, or does Pennywise's eternity of chosen cruelty put him in a category nothing else can touch? And do you think Stranger Things had the courage to treat Vecna with the finality he deserved? I want to hear exactly where you land on this one.